All right, so let's talk about the NASB 2020 translation. I like to buy Bibles for people sometimes when I can. And this is one that I found on christianbook.com for a really good deal. And it's normally I have always stuck to the 1995 NASB. That's what I got when, really what led to my salvation and what I've used ever since I became a Christian at 15. So that's been the 1995 edition's been my go-to for, let's see, that would have been, so I was 15, so 28. So what is that, 13 years? And I normally would buy the 1995 NASB study Bibles or ESV study Bibles for kids or people that I know that need a Bible. And I saw this one and I love thumb indexed. And this one was thumb indexed. So I thought, well, maybe, 2020 edition will be a good edition. So I preemptively just bought a couple to give away. And then when they came in, I was like, wow, these are really beautiful Bibles. And so I ordered, because I need to buy some more anyway, so I ordered about 20 more. And I was going to keep one for myself to be my new Bible that I'm going to study with. So anyway, this is what it looks like, NASB 2020. In this version, which is the large print, personal size reference Bible, thumb index, which I absolutely love. I've become completely dependent upon those. And there's some other things too. So let me show you one on my desk here. Sorry. The studio is a mess, as you can tell. So I always complain to my wife for leaving stuff out. I guess I can't really anymore because my studio is a slot pen. So anyway, this is what it looks like. The spine. It's just it's a beautiful Bible. It's not genuine leather, but it feels like it. It feels amazing. It feels super quality. It's just a beautiful Bible. And I love the gold sides here. It just looks really good. But anyway, when you open it up, it does have, if you wanted it to give it as a gift, it has that part. So you can say presented to you by so-and-so, which I love that when I give somebody a Bible. It's just a nice way to remember, for them to remember and for you to remember. And anyway, the inside is the large print, so it's just gorgeous. I absolutely love it, especially when you're in the Old Testament and like Psalms. The text is just, it's extra spacing between the text and the way the verse by verse goes. It's beautiful. And when you get to the New Testament, it looks like this, and it's got red letter, this version of it. So anyway, this is the 2020. So today what I want to talk about is this translation has a really bad reputation, or at least in some circles it's been bashed a lot because of some of the things that they've done with the 2020 update. And we're going to talk about those and see if it's, some of the changes may be a deal breaker for you. I don't like some of the changes. Some of the changes I do like. I think they made some corrections since the 1995 version. But some of them are less than optimal. I think there are some things they've done to make it more readable and not as accurate. And we'll look at that. But anyway, that's what it looks like. Really gorgeous Bible. It's going to become what I use now for the next year. And I'm going to be analyzing it more fully. But this is just kind of my first impression and some of the controversy around the 2020 version that I've heard. Well, welcome back to Science, Faith, and Reasoning. Today, again, we're talking about the NASB 1995 compared to the NASB 2020, which came out, obviously, a few years ago, and I had never had one. I saw that it came out around shortly after it did come out, and I was like, well, I'm happy with my NASB 1995, or what some people call the NASB 1995, and I just saw no need to upgrade, and I really don't have any need to upgrade now because I love the NASB 1995. I've used this. Let's see if I can pull it up here. I've used this since I got saved, and I love it. I love the NASB 1995. I think it's a great translation. It's extremely accurate. It's really been the standard, I would say, since shortly after it came out. Word got around that it was more literal. Greek, people who study Greek and Hebrew liked it a lot because it was easier to compare it. I know nothing about either of those languages, but from what I hear, it's easier to compare to the original languages, so people like that a lot. So it was a great translation. 1995, I absolutely love it. There's only one mistake that I've ever found in it that I think is a mistake. that I would think that the Lockman Foundation would also think is a mistake because they changed it in the 2020 version. But for the most part, I love it. And then this 2020 version, like I said earlier in the little clip where I was showing it off a little bit, I saw it. I was needing to buy it for a gift for somebody, and I saw how beautiful it looked. And I had to buy it. Like, it was a great deal for what it looked like. And it had the thumb index, which I think is a must. I love the thumb index. And then after I bought some, I wanted to buy some for at least one for myself. I've got some more back there you can see that I'm going to be giving away too. But I wanted one for myself because it's the perfect size for, this is the 2020 version that's thumb indexed. Now, it's not a study Bible, so that's one reason it's a lot smaller, but this is it next to, that's how much thinner it is there on the edge, about an inch or more thinner than the 1995 version. It's about close to the same width, a little bit thinner width-wise, but to have a Bible to take to speak somewhere, or to take to, if you go to witness to somebody or you're doing something like that, this is a great size to carry around with you, to flip through quickly where it's not so big that you have to lug it around. I think that's a much better size for doing that sort of thing. So I just wanted a more compact Bible, so I ordered one for myself, and I've got some that I'm giving away. But anyway, I'm rambling here. Let's get into the 2020, because the 1995 was really a good standard for a literal Bible, more literal Bible translation. And the 2020 is trying to maintain that sort of reputation, and we're going to see if they should still have that reputation, because I think some of these changes that they've made are more towards a dynamic, readable, more clear type of translation than it is trying to be more literal. And I'll show you where that's the case. So let's get into the preface, or the preface, however you say that, to the NASB 2020. Because in it, it really lays out why a lot of these changes are the way they are. At least they're, honest about some of these changes. So they start out with the verse, Isaiah 40, verse 8, which says, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever." And I love that as a motivational verse for making a Bible translation, because it's not about changing things just for the sake of changing things. It's trying to render this text according to what God's word has said forever, and rendering that text as accurately as possible and reliably as possible. And it says, "The New American Standard Bible has been produced with a conviction that the words of Scripture, as originally penned in the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, were inspired by God." So thankfully they start with a foundation that we would say is orthodox, Christianity, great. And obviously they're the 95 edition. I don't know about previous NASB translations, but I know they've been good in the past. So they talk about their aims with the translation. If you're familiar with 95 version, you probably at least would know these after reading them, that's what they tried to do. But anyway, they say some things about the King James being a great version, and how the Bible has been, how that has been used, and then the ASV appeared, and the NASB appeared, and that these were translations trying to get back to the most original manuscripts that we could use, most reliable manuscripts. But anyway, like, we know all that. We know what they stand for. We know what they're trying to do. So what are the things that they've said about this translation that might be different from the NASB 1995? Well, one of their things they say is they want to make it modern, use modern English. And I think some of the changes, most of the changes, kind of come down to that. And they say the goal is to render the grammar and terminology in contemporary English when it was felt that the word-for-word literalness was unacceptable to the modern reader. A change was made in the direction of a more current English idiom. And we'll see some of that. Gender accuracy. That's really not controversial. They've been doing that, for a while. But gender accuracy, this is one of the controversial things. So it says, in past editions, it was common practice to translate the Greek word anthropol as men, and the Hebrew Adam, when used as a plural, as men, as well as the pluralistic uses of ish and similar words. The same was true for singulars as masculine. This was never intended to be gender exclusive when the context indicated that women were included. It was assumed at that time that readers inferred the inclusion of women. Of course, that would be based on who was it written to. Like, is this clearly talking about women? Then just because it said, men or brothers or whatever, like, clearly women are being given directions too. So they're just pointing that out. They say gender accuracy because they're being accused of being gender neutral, and they're saying they're trying to be gender accurate is how they're phrasing it. Is important, however, so in this edition, Greek and Hebrew words that are not actually exclusive in gender, as they are used in a given context, are rendered by inclusive terms such as people. Just as important, when the words in the original languages are in fact referring only to males or females, the distinction is maintained in English. So basically what they're saying is, if a passage is talking about men and women, it's instead of translating that Greek word anthropol as men, they might translate it as people, because it's talking to men and women, not just men. Even though if you were to literally translate anthropol, the most literal translation would be men, but because the context is clearly talking to men and women, they translate it as people or mankind or something like that. So then they talk about the word brethren, similar thing. So basically what they're saying, and this is actually not a similar thing, this is different, because here, instead of translating the word brethren as just brothers, because they're trying to make it more modern English usage, what they do is they take that word, that adelphoi, and they're translating it as brothers, but then usually it's just brothers. But if the context of the passage, like some of the epistles, is referring to men and women, then they will change that to, instead of just brothers, it'll say brothers and sisters. And they add that phrase, and sisters. And that is probably the most controversial thing they did with this translation. People are pretty mad about it. I'm not happy about it. I think it's a big mistake. Now, at least, and one of the great things I loved about the NASB 1995 is that in this translation, they would put in italics. Well, you're not going to be able to see that if I hold it up, but maybe I can pull it up on screen. They'll put in italics words in the New Testament or Old Testament that are not in the Hebrew or Greek that they've added in English to make the sentence read better. So, whatever it is, it might have and or whatever. Like they're adding little words to make it more readable, because if you didn't add those words to make it readable in English, yeah, it would be more literal to just take the Greek word and literally translate it every time, but you wouldn't, that's not how you would speak those sentences in English. And they're trying to translate it that way. So at least in this translation, although they're adding and sisters, which I disagree with, they're putting it in italics because they're showing you that those words are not in Greek, the and sisters part. They're adding it, put it in italics to show you it's not in the Greek, but for clarity that this is referring to men and women. It's kind of like what they do when they're referring to God in the second person, and they'll say he or him. They'll capitalize he and him, even though in the original languages it's not capitalized. But because they didn't have that capitalization, it was just Koine Greek was just all capital, or however you want to say it. It was all one letter case, and they're all close together with no spaces between the words. So they've capitalized him or he when referring to God, so that when I'm reading this, I know that this is referring to God. I've never found them make a mistake on that, but some people aren't comfortable with that. But I think it's fine. I like it because when I'm reading it, it's kind of like red letter text for Christ. I know it's referring to God. You know the red letters are Jesus speaking, and it adds clarity. This may add clarity, but what if they're wrong? What if it's not directions for men and women? And you've added and sisters in italics so that the reader will realize, okay, these directions I'm about to read are also for women, or might pertain to women later on in the passage. Like, what if you're wrong about that? Let the reader make that conclusion about who the directions are for based on the original language that's been most literally translated, and then they can make that decision. So I disagree with it, and I'll show you some examples. And then some things they'll change. It says here they change, instead of let us, they change it to let's when a proposal is being made by one or more persons within a group to engage in an action. A lot of these are just, I think just make it more readable, more understandable. And then, of course, they're using the 20th edition of the Nestle Allen text, and everything else is, pretty normal stuff. So let's get into some of these differences. The first one I want to look at is 1 Corinthians 6:18, because the only problem I ever had with the NASB 1995, and I never called it NASB until I made this video, because other people, I realized that's what they refer to it apparently. But the NASB 1995, the only problem I ever found, I went through a big like King James only investigation to see what that was about. I'll post the links to those videos here. And during that time, I started looking at the NASB 1995 to see, I wonder if there's any contradictions in this text or any mistakes that they made. And the only mistake that I found was in 1 Corinthians 6:18 that I found. I'm sure there's other mistakes. No translation is going to be completely perfect. But, and here's a comparison of 1995 NASB versus the 2020 in the King James. And the 1995 version, if you read 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee sexual immorality in the 2020 version. And in the 1995 version, it just says flee immorality. And it's so general. Like, it's way too plain. It says flee immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. It's like, okay, any immorality? And that doesn't even make sense because it's saying every other sin that a man commits is outside the body. But here in the 1995 version, it just says flee immorality. That would be any sin. So how can every other sin be outside the body? You know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't even make sense when you read it. And the King James says flee fornication, which could mean sexual, would mean some kind of sexual immorality. And then in the NASB 2020, it says flee sexual immorality. And the Greek word there is porneia. And the Greek word porneian, refers to sexual sin. It can be a general term to refer to a broad range of sexual sin. So the NASB 2020, one of the things I like about it is that it does fix that issue. It actually does say flee sexual immorality. So that's one of the things I actually like about the 2020 version. And the 1995 version in so many ways was superior to the translations that it's competing with, I guess you could say, during its time period, those 25 years. But in that one spot, it just really missed, and I really feel like people were missing out on that passage because it just says flee immorality when it should say flee sexual immorality. So while the NASB 2020 gets a lot of flack for some of these other changes they've made, I think that improvement is awesome and super necessary. Like I felt reservations about giving people the 1995 version just because of that one mistake, which some people may say, well, it's not that big of a deal. To me, that is a pretty big deal. I had still bought people NASB 1995s, but I do think that's a big mistake, and I'm glad they owned up to it and made the correction. So that's one good thing about them updating these every so often. Another part, an improvement, Ephesians 3:8-9. If you just want to read the comparison, it's more clear, it's more understandable in the NASB 2020. As soon as you open the new version, when you read just in Genesis starting out, you can tell it's written to be more clear. Like in the 1995 version, Genesis 1:2 says the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the 2020 version says, and the earth was a formless and desolate emptiness. And I think that just paints a better picture, a desolate emptiness. When I hear the word void, I'm like a vacuum, like an emptiness. I mean, yeah, that's good. But desolate emptiness, I think, paints a better picture, like humans aren't here yet. I don't know, I like that better. I don't read Hebrew, so I have no idea if that's more accurate, but I think that it just kind of reads more smoothly. And a lot of the changes are like that. And one thing I've noticed, too, is a trend in this new translation of the NASB 2020 is that a lot of the word changes make it reflect more like the NIV than it does the traditional NASB translations. And I think that has to do with them trying to make it more contemporary English and more readable. So anyway, let's go to some of the controversial stuff, because none of this is really, nobody's not buying a Bible because it said desolate emptiness instead of void, because it means the same thing. It's just easier to understand. But some people are probably not going to buy this Bible because of some of these other things we're going to talk about. So let's look at Romans 5:12. There was a guy who filled in for James White on a show a few years ago when this came out, and this is one of the things where he really focused on and was saying basically this is a horrible mistake, and he might have this Bible, read it on the side, but it wouldn't be his main piece of study, source to study the scriptures because of this. Basically, it hinged on this change right here. So Romans 5:12 in the 1995 version, it says, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all sinned." So the 1995 version said. The KJV reads the same thing. But then you'll notice the NASB 2020 and the NIV actually read the same in this verse. In the 2020 NASB, it says, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all mankind, because all sinned." And the NIV says to all people. So the problem is, or I guess the question would be, is mankind different from men? Men is more insinuative or insinuating of male. Mankind, I mean, it's mankind, so it kind of is. People is not, has no male connotations. Mankind, I think, has some. Men has a lot. Like if you say men, well, like it's very clearly male connotations there. So this is a big problem. People have a really big problem with this. When I first read it, or when I heard this guy's spiel on it, I was very uncomfortable, and I was like, "Ooh, did I just buy 20 of these Bibles? Did I just make a huge mistake to give these away to people?" But the more I've thought about it and the more I've looked into it, I really don't think it's a deal breaker. I do think it's a mistake, though. But a question I would ask, like this person who said that, I don't even know what his name is. Maybe he's like James White's son or something, but he said that, the 1995 version has been his go-to study tool for the scriptures, and me as well. But I would say, like, if this is a deal breaker for you, but the 1 Corinthians 6:18 verse isn't, and it's like, I feel like this, if this is a mistake, which I would probably say it is, I don't think it's near as bad of a mistake as the 1 Corinthians 6:18 saying immorality instead of sexual immorality. Like, is that even close to as bad of a mistake? At least this clearly means the exact same thing. In 1 Corinthians 6:18, that is a different meaning. Like, that's a mistake. Like, you're not conveying the message of God in this one part of the New Testament as it should be conveyed, in my opinion. And I think Lockman Foundation would agree, because they changed it in the 2020 version to sexual immorality. But also, too, with this, where I think it may not even be a big deal necessarily. It could be. But the thing is, like, we don't know if Paul means when he says this, so death spread to all men, or death spread to all mankind. Clearly, when sin entered the world, it spread to both men and women. So it spread to mankind. When he said in verse 12 that it spread to all men, clearly he meant men and women. Now, that's not the Greek word that he used. He didn't use a word. I mean, the word is anthropos. And it could be translated as mankind, but the most literal translation is men or man. So for it to be translated as men would be more literal, but it's not inappropriate to be translated as mankind. It could be translated as human. Those are those kind of secondary ways it could be translated. Or as the NIV says, people. I don't think that's necessarily inappropriate. The problem, though, that you get with this is mankind is not as masculine as men. And the problem that this person has with it is that he's saying it's removing that theme of male headship in the scriptures. And I don't know if I would say that, although I do think it's better to leave it up to just put it more literal, just put men, and then let us decide if it applies to men and women. I mean, obviously it clearly does. But don't make it less literal because you as the translator are trying to make us think a certain way about the text. I'd rather you just make it more literal and then leave it up to the person who's reading the scriptures to interpret it, whether it's pertaining to both men and women. Now, I do think there is a place for a more dynamic translation that tries to make it more understandable and clear, read more easily without always going with the most literal translation. And no translation always goes with the most like textbook literal word for word type stuff. No translation does it completely literal. The NASB doesn't even say they're trying to make it word for word completely literal. Obviously not. But in the past, they have a history of doing it, I would say, the best in terms of being the most literal and most readable. And with this translation, I think that they're kind of moving more towards, in a lot of areas, towards kind of that NIV more dynamic than formally equivalent type of translation. And I think there's a place for that. Like the NIV, if I had an NIV, I would read it, I would study it, and I would just understand that it's a more dynamic translation. So when I really need to get specific about something, I would do a little more research about it without just looking at the NIV. And I think with this NASB 2020, I'm going to have to do that more. I'm going to have to check on it and make sure that I'm getting a more literal and accurate presentation of the text, because now I know that they've gone real dynamic in some areas where they used to be more literal. So anyway, and really like this 2020 version, this is going to be what I study scripture with for the next year. I'm committing to that. This is kind of my first impressions video, just from some of the things that I've heard about it, some of the controversial things. I'm going to spend a year reading it, studying it, hopefully getting through most of the corpus of the scriptures, and then trying to just see, comparing it to my 1995 version and the King James version, and just seeing like where are those changes, how dynamic have they gone with this. So let me show y'all a clip from the James White guy, and then we'll kind of talk about it as he goes. So let's play this. I'm in the way here.
Everybody, but the fact that men are singled out raises the level of accountability on men and not on women. Did women become sinners? Yes. Did death spread to women? Yes. But that's not Paul's point, I would argue, in Romans 5:12. His point is that because through one man, all men, because Adam was the head of the human race, and now all of the heads have this sin that has spread to them through the one man who was the original head. And so when you begin to accommodate the culture, what is happening in Romans 5:12? Well, male headship is being undermined. I don't know the motives of the NASB 2020 translators. I don't know that they're trying to undermine male headship and male accountability before God for being leaders of their families and leaders of society. But they've done that. They've done that by removing the masculine term there and replacing it with a term that is more generic.
Yeah, and I think that may be true, that they have removed the headship theme from that passage if it was there. I think mankind still has male connotations, but like I've looked through some of the other scriptures that are laying out the roles of men and women. Like if you look at Ephesians or Genesis or Corinthians, it's still extremely clear about men are the heads of the house. Men are, sin came through one man, Adam. Like all of those things are crystal clear. And they've only done this in a couple of areas, so I don't think it's like we've removed the theme of male headship in the scriptures. I just think in that part, if that's what Paul meant, then the more literal translation of anthropos gives us more insights. It gives us another like little Easter egg into male headship that we're missing now because we've rendered it more general. Again, for me, it's not like, oh crap, now I'm not gonna, give people this Bible. Not a deal breaker for me, although I do think it's a mistake. And no translation is going to be perfect, and this one's no exception. And actually, what's funny about this, and I guess some people cared, but the NIV has been like this for forever. And it was just understood that the NIV is more dynamic. And we're like, okay, yeah, they use people instead of men sometimes, and it seems like this more kind of, a lot of their sentences, instead of being more literal, they were more general. And they're easy, it's really easy to read. And that's why it's so popular and people love it. You can get all the doctrines out of the NIV. You're going to get all the doctrines out of the NASB 2020. But when you go more dynamic, shaking the camera here, when you go more dynamic, you miss a lot of deeper things that you get from that literal word for word type of translation. And that was the great benefit to the NASB 1995. And that's what I loved about it so much, is that it had this reputation of literality that was such a high bar and also pretty readable. It's more awkward than like the ESV. I think the ESV reads really well. The NIV is super easy to read. Like it reads like modern English people speak. And I think that's what they're trying to do more with the 2020. And not a huge fan of some of the changes. Some of the changes I like a lot. But that one I'd say it's a mistake. And I hope they correct it in the next version. But anyway, I don't think it makes the NASB 2020 like an apostate demon Bible. Although I do think I just think it's a mistake. And that's what's great about having the Greek to look at. Not that I can even read Greek, but you can do word studies and you can look at how other translations have translated it, and look at some interlinear Bibles and things like that. And there's some accountability. If all we had was one English translation, we'd never know if anything's right or wrong, if anything's more literal. You would just have no clue ever. And thankfully, we're not in that situation. So let's look at another change, because this one, it's kind of the similar thing. 1 Timothy 2:1-2. It says in the 1995 version, it says, "First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity." And in the 2020 version, by the way, King James says the same thing pretty much. But the NASB 2020 says, "First of all, then, I urge that request, prayers, and intercession," which I think is much more understandable, request, prayers, intercession, than entreaties, which I don't think anyone even knows what that means. Like your common person probably don't even know what that means. Prayers, petitions, and thanksgiving. I just think the NASB there reads better, but then it says, "In thanksgiving be made in behalf of all people, for kings and all who are in authority." And I think this is a big mistake. I believe, let's see, did I put the Greek word in here? I want to say it's also anthropos. It probably, I don't have it here. I think it was anthropos though, but this is one of those passages where it's like, okay, it says for kings and all who are in authority right after that. If we're talking about authority, we're talking about male leadership, male headship here, and you're changing it to people, and it's just too general. I feel like the literal translation of that as men has the connotations that it should have, especially in that context with for kings and all who are in authority, and that male leadership is, a divinely appointed thing. I just think that that's God's design, and we're trying to make something general that doesn't need to be made general. And it kind of goes back. Let me pull this guy's video back up, because I think he says this right here. Let's see.
And we see this, as they do this throughout the translation. Genesis 6:5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth. Again, yes, every person is certainly involved in that, and yet there's a sense in which God holds the fathers and the men responsible as leaders, and we need men today who will stand up and be men.
Right, and I think he's right. I would agree with that. And again, I think it's just you're getting more general where you should be. I would say you should be more specific, and that's just a miss. It's a miss. It's a mistake. And my thing too with that is, if you're going to change it to people, from men to people, you better be 100% sure that people, you're not missing anything from that more literal translation of it. If you can be 100% sure of that, then yeah, put people, but you can never be. And that's why I love the 1995, how it erred on the side of literality. Now, of course, I'm picking out the more controversial portions of the text, so it's not like, you're going to see the phrase non-binary in there somewhere. It's really solid in a lot of areas that I've read. I've just picked out the more controversial ones. So anyway, this is the one. This is the "and sisters," quote unquote, conundrum. So in the 1995 version, it says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." And in the 2020 version, it says, "I urge you, brothers and sisters." Okay. And in the NIV, actually says "and sisters" as well. KJV says "brethren." 1995 version says "brethren." Really, to make it if you simply just wanted to make it more common modern English, instead of "brethren," you would have said "brothers." And that's what they said in their preface that they would do. Unless, as they said in the preface, that it pertains, this part of Scripture is clearly meant for men and women, then they would add the phrase "and sisters" to show that as soon as you start reading that, okay, you know this is applying to men and women. And again, if they're completely right that it is, then you're getting a better, you understand immediately that this is clearly for men and women, and then you'll get to what they're actually talking about. Kind of like the capital H for he and him when it's referring to God, which I love the capital H for he and him when it's referring to God, but you're not adding an entire word. It's kind of like the red letter thing. And I think this is another level of that I think is inappropriate. Now, where they save themselves here is by putting it in italics. And that's one thing I love about the NASB translations is they put in italics, as we talked about before, words that are not in the Greek, but that might be implied by the Greek by the context. And you'll see they have other words in there, which is in italics. So like if you read that without the words in italics, it would be more literal, right? Acceptable to God, your spiritual service of worship. It's like, what? That reads weird, but it makes more sense to say, which is your spiritual service of worship. And the King James is the same thing. Like, they have to imply English words, otherwise it doesn't make any sense in English. But adding that entire phrase, and sisters, I think is a huge mistake. So anyway, that's the most controversial thing right there to me about this translation. The men, mankind, it's like, okay, maybe it's not that different, but the ancestors thing is a big difference. And if you look at the NIV there, they add the ancestors, but it's not in italics. So if you read that as just, a layperson, you have no clue that isn't in the original Greek language, and you think it is. And I think that's a huge problem. That's what I love about the NASB is that they put it in italics. So they're honest and upfront about what's in the original language and what's not, so that then you can just draw your own conclusions about it. So at least it's honest. So in that case, I think it's the saving grace of the 2020 version is what doesn't belong. Immediately you know. Now the problem is I think a lot of people who read this 2020 version or any of the NASBs probably have no clue that they even do that. So I think when you get a Bible translation, you should read the preface, and you should compare it to other translations, and compare it to the KJV, compare it to the 1995 NASB, compare it to the ESV, and you kind of know those mindsets of how these translations were made, and you start to understand why the differences are there, and then you start to learn more about the original terms, the original languages, and even like manuscript differences, and you just become a more well-rounded student of the scriptures, really. So I would say you don't necessarily need to have just one translation. I think if you're going to, I would go with probably the ESV, the 1995, or the KJV if you only had one, or I like the New King James as well. But with the newer versions, I think it's helpful to always be comparing them to older versions, always be comparing them as far as you are able to original Greek manuscripts that you can find those articles about in those research papers and those word studies, because you got to hold them accountable, and people are holding them accountable for these changes. And again, these aren't changes that to me are deal breakers, but I think they're mistakes. And there's mistakes in the 1995 version. There's mistakes in the King James. There's mistakes in all these versions. The New King James, the ESV. I actually haven't found any of the ESV yet, but I haven't studied it that much. But you're always going to find a mistake with a Bible translation. A perfect translation obviously is an unachievable goal, but it's something we should strive for. And at least with comparing these things, we can hold them accountable. And I've only done, a few weeks of study since I've gotten this version of the Bible. But I'm going to use it for a year. I'm going to compare it to the 1995 version. Hopefully a year from today, I can do a 1-year review, and we'll see how my opinion of it has changed. But I think there's things about it that I'm really going to like. So overall, I don't think it's a reason to burn the NASB 2020. I wouldn't even say it's a reason to avoid it. I would just say learn about it. Learn the differences and understand those. So when you're given a message on, one of those passages, you can reference that original term and say that, it should be more specifically men. So it really just makes it more, to me, I think the NASB kind of has to back off a little bit and say, okay, we're not as literal as we used to be. And they kind of say that in the preface, and just admit that now you're more dynamic. And now we'll understand, okay, now I know the NASB has moved away from being as literal as possible, and they're moving more towards more readable and more dynamic translation. And, I wouldn't say burn the NIV either, but I understand that it is so dynamic that if I really need to know something, like what is the actual very specific literal nature of this, I'm going to have to look into it more. And I found that to be true with even the 1995 version and like the King James. You still have to go back sometimes. When you see that word fornication, it's like, okay, what does fornication mean? What does the Greek word porneian mean? How can it be translated? What is the context here? And you learn more about it. So a lot of times you're doing that anyway. But I think overall I'm really going to enjoy this. I think it's definitely the most beautiful Bible I've ever seen. It's the perfect size, this version of it, and I'll post a link to it on, I bought it from christianbook.com, and I just think it's a great, like structurally and everything else, it's absolutely beautiful, and I think I'm really going to like it. But I'm going to be looking for those words in italics, and anytime I see gender pronouns used in it, I'm going to be checking with older translations and seeing if they've done it correctly. And then I'll be checking on those places where they add that ancestors phrase in italics for clarity, as they say, and see, okay, does this passage actually pertain to men and women? And, if they've added that in a place where it doesn't, like, just think about how big of a mistake that would be. So anyway, I'm definitely going to be looking into that. Improvements to it, I think that 1 Corinthians 6:18 is a huge improvement. That it actually says sexual immorality now. Like, that's awesome. So I think about teenagers that are reading this, or anybody that has struggled with lust, especially teenagers, because that's just like that time of your life, that seems to be a big problem for a lot of people, to read that, flee sexual immorality, the mindset that creates around that topic versus flee immorality is just a world of difference. So I think some of the improvements make it better than the 1995 version, and then some of those changes I think make it worse. So it's kind of a mixed bag. My overall review of it is it's a mixed bag, but I do like it overall, and I think it's hopefully going to stay true. 99% of it stay true to that literal nature of what the NASB has always, prided themselves in being more literal. But anyway, I'd like for you to leave some comments on this video. Let me post some things for me that I need to look into. I'm going to do a year review of this, and leading up to the end of the year, or this time next year, I want to know some things that you've already noticed in this that might be mistakes. So anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.